Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are excited to have you joining us. Look forward to hearing some of the conversations today. I will note that as you come into today's session, which is entitled um, Doing the Work Together, Authentic Engagement from the Northeast and Caribbean PTTC, we have a discussion question that we would love for you to respond to in the chat. And in particular, we would love for you to share your responses with everyone in the room, because we'd like for you to have an opportunity to communicate with your colleagues who have joined for today's session. So welcome. We're excited to get started in just another minute or so. But as you enter the room, we hope that you will take this opportunity to respond to the lobby question that you see on screen. Noting, when you hear the phrase authentic engagement, we'd love to hear for you what comes to mind. What does it make you think of? How do you define it? How would you describe it? My name is Ivy Jones Turner, and we'll just get getting started in just another minute or so. We look forward to seeing some of the rich comments and conversation that we'll have today throughout today's session. And we are excited to have you joining today. I'm beginning to see some of your responses come in. This is great to see. See some responses that note being present. Authentic engagement is being present and listening, being truthful, honest, transparent. The concept of nothing for or to us without us. I love that extraction of the usual phrase. Thanks so much for that, Greg. We also see others noting that authentic engagement to them means real partnership and working together, active listening, displaying and hearing genuine interest from partners. Looks like we're going to have a great conversation today. We look forward to hearing some more of your comments as you post them in the chat. And again, we really look forward to seeing the conversation, not only with us, but also with your colleagues. So we ask that you just respond to any of the poll questions, as well as anything else that comes up during the session today, by posting it in the chat and sharing it with everyone. That way we'll have an opportunity to really engage and hopefully have some authentic engagement of our own. So why don't we go on and get started with today's session? I'd like to welcome and thank you again for joining us today. This session is being hosted by the Northeast and Caribbean PTTC, or Prevention Technology Transfer Center. The title of today's session is Doing the Work Together. It's a continuation of our sessions on really thinking about authentic partner engagement in prevention. And last week, we had an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how do you negotiate that win-win experience with your partners when there's a challenge with their maybe initial response of a no or something along those lines. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about that next stage and speak to authentic partner engagement in prevention. So I'd like to thank you again for joining us. As we go to our next slide, I'd like to introduce you to the Northeast and Caribbean PTTC. The mission and the goal of the Northeast and Caribbean PTTC include providing high-value training and technical assistance that meets the current and future needs of preventionists and the prevention workforce, stakeholders, and policymakers in Region 2. Region 2 is comprised of New York, New Jersey, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. And we're excited to work with those of you who are from Region 2, as well as welcoming those of you who are joining us from across the nation. We hope that during this conversation, we'll have an opportunity for you to not only hear and share some additional awareness of evidence-based strategies and promising practices, but also that this will be an opportunity for you to contribute to and receive a great input and strategies and ideas from your colleagues with regards to increasing your knowledge, your skills of prevention, and how you as a prevention practitioner might strengthen your efforts in your local community. Throughout today's session, we're going to have an opportunity for not only training, but also some TA. And so we ask you and invite you to share comments, questions, as well as challenging situations that you've encountered in the chat. This will be part of our priority for developing some of those strategies that really reflect a culturally responsive and humble approach to prevention and working with diverse practitioners, researchers, policymakers, family members, and consumers. Today's webinar, as we go to our next slide, you'll see that we have a disclaimer that just notes that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing the recording as well as the slides with those who have registered for today's session. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, we ask that you please don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact information will be available at the end of today's session, but you can also feel free to write your comments or your questions as a personal or private chat to the hosts and panelists. In addition, we really rely on your feedback and input to really strengthen and plan our sessions for prevention practitioners throughout our region. And so in particular, we're going to ask that you provide your responses and feedback to a GIPRA survey that will have the link posted at the end of today's session. So we look forward to hearing your comments, your feedback, and your thoughts. Now, I'm going to introduce today's presenters and speakers for this session. I'd like to start with my colleague, Jessica Goldberg, who is a training and technical assistance specialist with nearly a decade, actually a decade plus, of supporting prevention efforts at the national, state, regional, and local levels. Jessica initially started her prevention work in the field as a community health specialist with the Massachusetts State Technical Assistance System, supporting communities in needs assessments, strategic planning, and creating logic models to really guide change efforts. And then with the Center for the Application of Prevention Technologies, or the CAPS. Now with the PTTC, Jess is a certified prevention specialist and holds both an MSW and MPH degree. Also, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ivy Jones-Turner, and I have been working in prevention and organizational capacity assistance on health promotion in substance abuse, suicide, violence, injury, and mental health with nonprofit and community-based organizations, state and faith-based agencies, and school districts. Some of my capacity skills include program evaluation, training and technical assistance on program design and implementation, and also organizational development, partnerships, and collaborations. So I'm excited to join with Jess today and leading this session to share with you more about authentic engagement and working effectively with your partners. So on the next slide, what we'd like to do is just highlight for you a couple of key points that are of value, not only in this conversation, but we hope that you'll take these throughout your efforts and your work with communities and individuals. And that is the role and importance of affirming supportive language and really making sure that we are putting our people first and making sure that our affirming language really promotes not only evidence-based, but also culturally informed and culturally humble practices in our efforts. So as we move forward, I'd like to highlight for you our learning objectives for today's session. And those learning objectives include really an opportunity for us to dig a little deeper into partnerships and collaborations, building on some of our conversation last week. Specifically today, we're going to go through some guiding principles of authentic engagement and speak a little bit more about some of the differences between traditional and shared leadership models. We're going to discuss some of the strategies for fostering trusting relationships with members of diverse community groups, and of course, speak with you further on how to support your communities in identifying solutions to their substance misuse related problems, such that you can see and support community-led efforts in prevention. Our hope is that through this session, we're going to really explore what it takes to create some of those meaningful opportunities for not only shared leadership and decision making with your partners, but also to really foster deeper, more trusting relationships, and as well to continue to support that community-led prevention efforts. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jess, who will begin us with a review of last week's session and as well uh, highlight a couple of things about authentic engagement. Jess?
Thank you so much, Ivy, for starting us off so beautifully, and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, or good morning to you all. So glad you're able to join us here today. So like Ivy said, we're going to start with some level setting here today to explore what it means to authentically engage with our partners and the members of the communities we serve, and look back a little bit on what we discussed last week. So on our next slide, I'm going to just start off by asking you to think back to a time when you were part of a group or a process, and during that experience, you felt really engaged in what you were doing. So maybe you were really present or captivated by what was going on, eager to participate and to be involved in different ways. And so think back to that experience and consider what were some of the qualities of that experience itself that led you to feel that way. So I'll ask you to just take a moment and reflect on that experience. And when you're ready, feel free to share what contributed to you feeling engaged in the chat. And as you're thinking, I just want to say that this could be an experience from your professional work as a prevention practitioner or partner. It could be from another professional role that you've held, or as a member of a group in your community. So anything goes in terms of the type of experience. What we're looking for and what really matters is that you are engaged as being a part of it. So we'll just look to the chat and see if we can find some examples of things that might have contributed to you feeling that way. So take your time, because I know it's a big question. When you're ready, feel free to share and we'll debrief what comes into the chat. Thanks, Kelsey, for starting us off. So a facilitator that's enthusiastic in the process can make a huge difference. I've definitely worked with communities where, the coalition coordinator or director, it's not that they're charismatic, but they're so invested, so involved in the work and just excited to be leading it, that enthusiasm is really infectious. It's really contagious, actually. And you can feel it around the table that other people get more and more bought in because of their commitment and their enthusiasm. So thanks, Cora. So feeling heard, feeling like you've contributed, having a meaningful role, right, in the discussion, that people want to hear your point of view and want to hear, your ideas, and that you're very much a valued member of the group. So someone that has experienced the same issues or situations and got through it, right? So you're with you're with people with shared experiences. I was going to say, there's a word that's escaping me, but you're in good company with the people that you're involved with, right? Because they are going through what you're going through or have gone through and able to share that perspective. So people who talk with the group and not at the group, it's a really subtle difference, but when someone's talking at you versus when someone's in conversation with you, right? So having a safe space, having your ideas be received enthusiastically and either adopted or kind of workshopped and maybe modified a bit before accepted, being invited to share ideas and perspective, not just listen to being asked to sign on to someone else's vision. Really, these are beautiful reflections all. And then the participants were asking questions and they were interested. So being part of a group that's really engaged sort of leads to engagement, right? And all of these things are true. I mean, I can say for myself, I remember feeling really engaged when I'm inspired by the focus of the work, right? Whatever area we're focusing in, and feeling connected to and valued by the people that I'm working with. So just like yourselves, it sounds like many of you share that. I'm thinking back to a project I did when I was in school, And it was about preventing childhood obesity, I remember. And I was really, really feeling close to the classmates I was working on it with. But I was learning so much because I had no idea about healthy eating when I was a kid whatsoever, that I was learning so much that I was really excited to share what I had learned with other people, because it really had riveted me as a topic. And so thanks so much for sharing your experiences. And we wanted to start here just to see if we could distill from our collective experience and wisdom, some of those key components of authentic engagement. And so on the next slide, since we're here to have this conversation along with you, hopefully talking with you and not at you, and to learn from you all who are doing this work as well, we want to offer some ideas around a shared definition for authentic engagement. And what we're really talking about here from our perspective is a process that promotes the participation of people within a community, especially those who have been traditionally or typically excluded or isolated, by engaging them in collective action to create a healthy community. And so it's a very fluid and dynamic process. And it has the power to impact many different systems within a community and to create lasting community change. What's most important in terms of authentic engagement is that there's agreement between the partners in terms of what the community issues are that most need to be addressed. And this is really key. It's that self-definition of community problems, as well as the ownership for developing solutions for those problems, that really creates an authentic engagement environment. So it's not just that it's us or someone else coming into a community and saying, here's what the data say, here are the issues, let's address them. It's very much something done in collaboration with and following the lead of the community to define and solve these issues. It also involves expanding the way we think about leadership and allocate leadership roles so that it's not always the usual faces around the table. And this involves the process of growing relationships, and that involves building trust, and that takes time. It takes time and patience. It takes intention and humanity and humility. And we do this without agenda, right? So, we're building those relationships for relationships' sake, not only to advance our goals in substance misuse prevention or whatever arena we're working in, right? It's only from that kind of place of trust and understanding that we can work toward a collective vision for creating community change, right? We're keeping a close watch on what has worked for us in the process, how we can strengthen a process to make it more equitable, more inclusive, to ensure that the goals and outcomes that we identified at the beginning, when we all define those problems and solutions together, that those solutions would create those positive outcomes. And we want to make sure that that vision is equally shared across all segments of the community, such that we all, when those outcomes are achieved, can access and participate and benefit from our efforts. And then, sometimes I just want to say there's this tension between relationships and outcomes, right? Like, if we're really investing in developing relationships, that might not happen on a timeline that aligns with our action plan. So, how do we make decisions about that when we might feel pressure from funders or from our own team about getting things done, and recognize, how the investment of time in the relationship building process will really, pay out in the long run in terms of facilitating our forward movement after the fact. And so the next slide, I will share a graphic. It's a graphic that I love. It's the spectrum of engagement and prevention. And you can see very clearly how we move toward authentic engagement, moving left to right. And if we could just click one more time, you'll see, the key takeaway here is that outreach is not engagement. Providing information is not engagement. Neither is asking for comment or collecting information from individuals and groups, not necessarily. Depending on how it's done, it might be a form of engagement, but it's really when we get to that place of true partnership, when we're engaging communities in our decision-making efforts, and implementing collective prevention services or collaborative prevention services, where we're sharing responsibility, we're working in concert with each other, that's when we're really engaging our partners. And so it's the difference between, and I know someone said this in the chat, when we're doing something being done for community members as opposed to being done with community members, right? And that's just it's not just a semantic distinction. It really drives to the heart of the work to authentically engage with community. So on the next slide, to make this work, we have to make sure that we have the people at the table who are not there simply because of the cultural identity groups they represent, so that we can say we have representation from this group on our coalition or team, but they're really there to reflect their own perspective and experiences, and not to speak for every other member of the group or groups that they identify with. So tokenism is about making, just the perfunctory or symbolic effort to recruit small numbers of people from underrepresented groups to give the appearance of equality. And we're definitely not suggesting anyone on the line here does this intentionally, but something I think that happens in coalitions sometimes, it's just because we're only able to get so many individuals to our prevention table when we rely on our more traditional engagement methods. So it's certainly not implying that anything is done intentionally, but sometimes we do have the experience with there's one or two individuals representing a certain group who might feel like they're responsible for reflecting or representing the view of that entire group, as opposed to just coming in with their own individual perspective and sharing that. So we want to avoid that at all costs. And we also need to bring an orientation of both cultural humility and cultural competence to this work. And I had another trainer just literally last week help me better understand the distinction between these two terms. And so to define them, cultural humility is a humble and respectful attitude toward individuals of other cultures that pushes one to challenge their own cultural biases, realize they can't possibly know everything about other cultures, and approach learning about other cultures as a lifelong goal and process. That's cultural humility. And then cultural competence, in the simplest definition, is the ability of an individual or an organization to interact effectively with members of diverse population groups. And so to contrast them, humility is about our attitude and our way of thinking about this work. It's about making that lifelong commitment to be open to learning about other cultures. And then cultural competence is about being able to work with members of other cultures effectively. So I had started to shift my own language away from the term competency because, like many other people, I felt like it implied that there was this endpoint we were trying to reach, that it's possible to become competent in either one's own culture or in someone else's culture. But I was mistaken, or I had forgotten that practicing cultural competence is really an ongoing process as well, and it requires a lot of time and learning and critical reflection. Cultural competence is not binary. It's not someone is or isn't culturally competent, right? It can be more of a continuum where there are different levels of competence, respect, and responsiveness as we grow in our own understanding over time. And it's also really important to understand, that it's unrealistic and unfair to the experience of culturally diverse people to describe cultural competence as something that you can simply have or acquire, right? You can't be culturally competent, but you can practice cultural competence or apply a culturally competent framework to your personal and professional endeavors. So, we see cultural competence when we're able to accept and respect, or show an acceptance and respect for culture consistently in our organizational policies, our structures, our practices, and attitudes. And when we hold culture in high esteem and use it as a foundation to guide our endeavors, right? And so we have to practice cultural competence. And I do want to acknowledge that we're not saying either that it's enough to just be able to work effectively with different groups. We're certainly called on more and more so every day to go further than that, to address systemic oppression of historically marginalized communities and to dismantle systematic and systemic barriers that create and perpetuate health inequities that lead to disparities around substance use or substance use disorders. But we need both humility and competence to do that work well. And so we've also already talked about a need for a different orientation to time to do this work well, and the importance of paying attention to both process and action and also outcomes. But a couple other important ideas include moving away from this idea of the right fit. Often when we look for staff or conduct outreach efforts, we might be thinking about, or not even consciously thinking about, who would fit into our current organizational dynamics, our personalities. And what we really need to be looking for are people who bring different ideas and ways of doing things, different experiences and perspectives, so we don't get stuck in that same loop of, this is how we do things. So sometimes when we say the right fit, we mean people just like us. And so we're hardwired in our brains through unconscious bias to sort people into us or them, into in groups or out groups. And that's part of human nature, but it doesn't mean it has to be that way, right? We can take steps to mitigate that tendency in ourselves and actively work to expand our circles so that we engage and benefit from a wider array of perspectives. And then finally, on this slide, doing this work is hard work. It involves our heads as we learn and grow in our competence. It involves our hearts as we engage in this work as individuals and professionals. And we also learn as part of the process with our hands, and as we truly start to engage and dig into that process. And so when we might feel inclined to judge ourselves or others, as we're walking together in this journey, we want to just invite you to turn that judgment into curiosity to better understand, what we each bring to this table and what our colleagues and partners are bringing as well. And then to be, gentle and supportive of ourselves and others as we travel down the road together. And so on the next slide, what you'll see is for the rest of our call today, we're going to focus in detail on 3 concepts related to authentic engagement: sharing leadership, building trust, trusting relationships, and supporting communities to lead efforts to solve identified problems. So that's looking forward. And then connecting back to last week's session on the next slide, we talked about getting partners to the table. So if you were able to join us for that session, you'll remember we spent a lot of time talking about how we can learn about our prospective partners, their positions, their interests, their beliefs, their values, and to begin developing relationships with them to prepare to make an ask of them to join or support our efforts in some ways. We also talked about what the elements of a compelling pitch were. When we want to go to a new partner and invite them to take part in our work. And then if we need to, we talked about how we can use the principles of negotiation to help identify a solution that works for everybody involved. And so the negotiation process that we described was really a collaborative approach. It focused on 3 elements. So first, taking the other person's perspective, which really means the active listening we saw you mention in the chat already today. So listening to their situation, asking questions and summarizing what you're hearing them say to make sure that you fully understand how they feel, observing their body language and their tone during the conversation, and then finally reflecting back to them and empathizing with them about their position given whatever issue you're discussing. And then in the second step, we share our own perspectives and we describe the situation as we see it, including what our challenges might be, how we feel about them emotionally, what it means to us to be in this position. And we talk about any needs that we have that are currently not being met. And then finally, as we work together, we want to bring this prospective partner in to our conversation with us as thought partners to try to find a win-win solution that moves beyond a compromise. We talked a little bit last week about in compromise, both parties end up giving something up and neither might be happy with the result. And so the type of negotiation we were suggesting could be most effective in prevention last week really focuses on finding a way forward that meets both parties' needs. And so that was just a very quick review of what we covered last week. And we definitely would invite you to take a look at the recording if you weren't able to join us, but hopefully you were able to be there for that session as well. And then the next slide will show you the link between this week and last week. So if we successfully bring a partner to the table into our prevention fold, we make our ask or we negotiate with them to find a shared solution, now we have to engage with them authentically. And the skills that inform one part of the process also inform the other. So if you're really going to share leadership, and Ivy's going to talk us through that in a moment, you'd have to be willing to understand another's perspective while giving your own as you work toward a collaborative solution. So if we just click ahead, you'll see that, that sharing leadership really relates to all of the negotiation skills we discussed last week. If your goal is to build trust, you certainly have to share of yourself and where you're coming from, and you have to be willing to have that exchange with your partner and hear their perspective. Um, and from that position of trust, you could also engage in collaborative problem solving together if the situation called for it, with a greater likelihood of success. And if that process were positive for all involved, then that would contribute to an even greater level of trust in the relationship. Um, and so then necessary to supporting community-led solutions is absolutely the ability to take perspective and to work collaboratively together to solve problems. It would likely also involve sharing your own perspective, but doing so with that full intention to follow the community's lead and support them in leading their own solutions. And so this lovely red web on the screen reflects, our understanding about how these topics of bringing people to the table and then engaging with them from a place of authenticity, how those relate, and then how the skills involved in both also relate and reinforce each other. And so that's it as far as stage setting goes. And then I'm going to pass it back to you, Ivy, now to talk us through what it means to share leadership.
Thanks, Jess. And thanks for providing that overview of both last week as well as some of our concepts for today. As we talk more about moving towards shared leadership and really thinking about increasing the opportunities for shared leadership within your coalitions, we'd love to hear you identify what are some of the strategies or methods that you're implementing or that you have tried in terms of your shared leadership approaches. And as you do that throughout this section and throughout today's session, we're going to actually talk a little bit more about, well, what does shared leadership really look like? So as we go to our next slide, we're going to start with a definition. And in particular, we're going to start with the definition of leadership. And what we really mean here. We want to note that in our conversation, we're going to talk about leadership and some of the other concepts, not just in terms of the individual and the role of the individual who may be a leader or considered leadership, but we're also going to talk about leadership practices within an organization. And so what do we mean by this leadership? It really does speak to first taking the focus of motivating others to work towards that common goal, both taking into account an awareness and knowledge of both the individual priorities of all of the individuals within a group, and really understanding what their motivations are and using that to help move them forward in accomplishing a goal, but also then taking into account what are the goals of the entire group, and how do we use all of that together in terms of supporting the common goal and moving towards that common goal. It also includes having a healthy dose of inspiration, both the focus of inspiring others not only to act in the interest of a goal that's broader than their own personal interests, but also helping to guide how they act. The fact that they will act maybe in a way that is different than their default or their standard operating procedure. We have those who are very maybe quick to focus on the process experience of a situation, but in being a leader, it means inspiring them to maybe use more of a task orientation, or maybe use more of a collaborative approach orientation, or maybe use more of an approach where they are stepping up or maybe stepping back and allowing others to engage. Another element in what we would consider the practice of leadership is a sense of how to strategically use whatever resources that are available to advance the common goal. Noting this might include making sure that everyone benefits fairly, which partners get funded, which partners get to hire staff, which partners might get to attend trainings or conferences, or even be those who are trained as trainers. In a shared leadership approach, it's really important to be clear about how some of these decisions are being made, as well as the members believing that this is really being decided and determined fairly without favoritism. In addition, we're thinking about how directing those resources is used to benefit everyone or benefit the good of all. This is how the activities of individuals and the group help to accomplish the common vision or the common goal, allowing for different ways of maybe the organization or the coalition's vision that might be focused, as well as depending on the stage of the effort. So that, for example, the resources and how we use those resources, be they people, be they trainings and access to materials and information, or be they funding, the way that those resources are used as a leader at startup looks very different when the organization or the coalition is either in crisis or conducting a needs assessment, or maybe even focused on that stage in the spiff of building capacity for sustainability, as we prepare to transition to a new grant initiative, etc. So it's really thinking about all of these components in terms of leadership. Now, we'll also note that some of these very same practices and roles you might be implementing or considering as you are serving as coalition leaders, either coordinators or partner members of a coalition. You might have already adopted a number of these into your practice. And so coalition members who might be working to advance the efforts and really contributing their staff time and other resources to meet the needs of the community, that's already being motivated or building on their motivation by that common goal, trying to accomplish that common goal. Um, as coalition staff, you might even modify or evolve the roles of your members. One of the coalitions that I'm working with has actually expanded the role of a partner such that the partner might have initially been called in and engaged as a member of the coalition to help broker relationships with particular communities, and help to network with the community. However, what the coalition has already begun to do is engage that partner, not just to broker and network with the community, but also to serve as a data collector as they conduct focus groups and help to collect data from members of the community that they work with. So there's a shift there in terms of leadership, in terms of not only the use of the resources, both in terms of training and time, and actually even paying through a stipend the organization to take on this additional role, but really helping to think about how to direct the activities of that particular partner for the benefit of everyone in the coalition. But let's talk a little bit more about some of the practices that might support authentic engagement through a shared leadership perspective. And so as we go to our next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about, well, what do we mean by shared leadership? This is where I think it really gets exciting, because as we think about leadership and we think about shared leadership in particular, um, you'll note that on the slide we've included a reference that shared leadership is more of that role of engaging more partners to be part of the leadership of the team in order to really influence and direct the broader group or the broader team and maximize the effectiveness of the team. Now, I'll note that a number of shared leadership models really talk about success when you're facing or trying to address complex problems. It really depends on an interdependent, coordinated leadership practice being used by individuals as well as the group and the organizations. It's really much more of a shift away from what used to be maybe that heroic action of a couple or a very small number of leaders within a group or an organization. You know, as we've really been moving more and more into the complexity of substance misuse and substance use disorders and really working to prevent these, we recognize that the problems by their nature are more complex. It's not just a matter of educate and therefore outcome of reduced substance use or prevented substance misuse. We're recognizing and acknowledging that there's an interrelatedness of our work and our efforts. We're thinking more about equity in terms of health equity and racial equity and what that means for how we collaborate and engage in partnerships with communities and various populations. We're also thinking about how the social determinants of health impact and are affected by our work. And so it's no longer a matter of us just saying, okay, well, while we're working on substance misuse prevention, we recognize that that's influenced by employment opportunities and the community development that exists in a local area, whether it be a rural community or maybe a suburban or an urban community. We're no longer just saying, okay, well, we can't address those issues. Let's put them on a back burner and leave them for someone else to address. We're actually in prevention recognizing that we have to address or we have to be aware of and integrate how we're addressing or how we are acknowledging the impact of the social determinants of health on our efforts. That also includes how we're working with our partners in supporting their efforts to address some of those social determinants of health. There's actually a perfect quote that I found that I think really, really nicely sums up some of this. And it's from Mary Parker Follett. She describes leadership in this model of shared leadership as not defined by the exercise of power, but by the capacity to increase the sense of power among those who are led together. And so the most essential work of the leader is to create more leaders. And Mary Parker Follett wrote that in 1924. So we see that there's really been a long trajectory of thinking about leadership, but thinking about how leadership needs to shift and incorporate more of a shared leadership model. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the strategies or some of the ways that leadership traditionally and leadership in a shared leadership model might differ. So on the next slide, you'll see a little juxtaposition that we've noted here. And in fact, I'll just note that most change leadership or change management models post leadership or describe leadership as a transactional and transformational model. The traditional model says in leadership that while it might apply to the individual leader or to a leadership committee or a team, the transformational leader sets a vision and then inspires others to commit to that and follow that vision that the leader has identified. That leader manages and has all power and authority, or most of the power and authority. They are in charge of the information or the data, whether they are the ones who hold all the data, or maybe they're the ones who receives all the data and has a sense of the complete picture of data because they're the central point, they're the central recipient. And then of course, in that model, it also notes that that leader is really delivering the solutions to the team, is really providing a vision for a group and then expecting the group to follow along. In addition to that transformational or that visionary approach, there's also the transactional component of leadership in the traditional models, which notes that there's much more of a tit for tat, carrot and stick reinforcement approach that's incorporated. And so, as just noted a little earlier, you can tell where there's less of the perspective taking and understanding the perspective of others that might happen within the traditional leadership model. And in particular, really understanding that perspective, not just in terms of how do I convey the information to a group, but really that perspective taking doesn't get to the how do I not only understand their perspective, but how do I incorporate their perspective? How do I share and build on their perspective. Now, the nice thing about this is that when we think about shared leadership or shared leaders, what we're thinking and noting here is that this model really reflects key differences on where power is located and how it's used. So instead of being led or managed by a small group or an individual, it's really distributed leadership across a wide group of participants. One of our common assumptions is often that sharing power means less for any individual, but actually what we find in the shared leadership is that power is increased in the collective team, that the more people who are participating and sharing power, the more power there is. Often, I think as we recognize that comes because there's a level of then additional investment and commitment by each individual. So not only are they bringing themselves, but they're bringing the weight of all of their power and contributing that to the effort. What we also find is that there's a lot more transparency in a shared leadership model. So it's not just a matter of having information, but making sure that that information has a cyclical sharing process. It comes in, it goes back out. It's shared with others. It's used by others. It's managed and freely available to all. And then, of course, team problem solving is a key part of the focus. You know, as Jess mentioned a little earlier, this really, again, in shared leadership, involves both the perspective taking and the perspective sharing as key steps in working towards a collaborative approach to solve problems and to meet needs. So let's talk a little bit more about how you might have done some of this. As we go to our next slide, we have a discussion question for you. And in particular, what we'd love to hear from you is, where do you see your coalition or your organization in terms of the leadership styles? Do you tend to incorporate more of the traditional leadership models, or do you incorporate more of the shared leadership models? And so we'd love to have you type that into the chat. And particularly as you type that into the chat, we'd love to hear maybe one or two examples of how you're seeing that maybe more shared or more traditional leadership model being reflected in your organization. Some of you might note that it comes as an example in terms of staffing and staffing decisions. I see a couple of people have noted that you're seeing a mix of both traditional and shared leadership in your organization. Others who are noting that you see shared or more traditional approaches. What are some of the indicators, or what are some of the ways that you are identifying that shared leadership models as well as some of those traditional leadership models? So we see that one person has noted that because we're expected to keep looking for new ways to grow our communities, others, and that's an example of the shared model, others are still being listed as supervisors and need to follow their recommendations. So great example there. For some, staff are being encouraged to explore and identify and recruit and engage. And others are hearing directly from supervisors, here's where and here's who. Interesting examples. Someone has noted that using some traditional leadership structure, but shared leadership strategies. And that's interesting. There are probably a number of our organizations where we will see some of that. Maybe some of the more formal structures that align more with the traditional leadership model, where maybe power and data and decision-making and leadership are all centered within certain roles or positions. And yet there is more of an expansion of that beyond what may have been existing in the past. And so, a really interesting comment that I see that says, there are multiple departments in the organization that this particular person works with. And so there are crossovers so that there's an opportunity for individuals to come together and share information, but also really looking at how that shared leadership happens in those contexts. Great examples. These are really interesting to see. And it sounds like there are also some key ways that your organizations are beginning to shift and incorporate more and more of a shared leadership model. And that's a great example of growth and development that's happening within our field and within our organizations. I think many of us would talk about or note change management and change and responding to change have been great motivators for addressing and incorporating more of a shared leadership model. Great. And so while we move on to our next slide, we'd like to invite you to hear just a couple of more examples of some keys and strategies for establishing and supporting shared leadership. Hopefully a number of these will be familiar as you think more about some of the shared leadership models and approaches in your organizations. Are there efforts and are there steps that are being used to create a safe environment where power may be shared, data may be shared and discussed by more than just those who have traditionally been the holders, the reviewers, the interpreters of data and of decisions or of vision? Making sure that there's also the opportunity to collaborate and really develop and communicate that vision together. So great ways of, really thinking about not just are we looking for feedback, and I think someone noted this, really thinking about how do we identify what the vision is in a collaborative way across different divisions or different departments within an organization. Incorporating strategies to challenge the status quo. And maybe that's expanding and noting for within organizations or within coalitions, hey, we've tried this strategy over here, it was successful. Let's try and expand that. Let's try something new. Let's try this approach that incorporates more of a shared leadership approach. Really enabling others to be part of not just identifying what some of the key communication strategies might be for that vision, but also to enact or to carry out and conduct some elements of that vision. And then, of course, strategies that really build on that collaborative approach of encouraging and modeling what we'd like to see among the group. And so as we go to our next slide, we want to continue to kind of hold some of these strategies for shared leadership in our minds, and then pose this discussion question for you. As you imagine a coalition that might currently use some traditional leadership models, with the coalition coordinator and the chairperson who are making and communicating decisions, in this particular coalition members have recently been taking more initiative, co-hosting meetings, maybe even hosting meetings at different locations, sharing responsibility for implementing coalition activities. Are there any additional strategies that you might suggest that this coalition could use to support moving forward towards a shared leadership model? What might be some strategies that you think could be shared or could be conducted and led and supported by the coalition coordinator and the chairperson in terms of supporting more of a shared leadership approach? Love to see just a couple of comments that you might have or thoughts that you have. I would imagine that for a number of you, you've also seen some of this happen within your own coalitions. And so if that's the case, we'd love for you to share a couple of examples of what you've done.
Ivy, and while people are thinking, I just want to jump in and say, I know one example that comes to mind for me is a coalition coordinator that actually help ask the coalition members to co-create the meeting agendas with her. So every month would send out an email and just say, what do we need to talk about at this meeting? And so it wasn't really her driving the conversation entirely, but responding to it and listening to and ultimately incorporating the perspective of the coalition members and what needed to be discussed at a given meeting.
Yes, that's a great one, Jess. And I've seen a coalition that actually has even incorporated an element similar to that, where not just the coalition leader manages or facilitates the meeting, but actually will divide up the agenda so that maybe a different partner is actually leading a particular section of the agenda. Sure. What we're looking to hear is maybe what are some additional strategies that a particular coalition might use? In this case, a coalition where the coalition members are actually taking on more initiative to engage in both responsibility for and implementing those coalition activities. What are some examples that you might suggest? If we think back to the previous slide, it might be that what are some strategies that you might have seen in terms of how coalitions might enable members to act, or how they might encourage one another to take on additional leadership? How might they model some of that behavior? And so while you do that, I'm going to go on to the next slide, because I know it might take a few seconds to think about some of those. I'm going to go into the next slide and then turn it over to Jess, who's going to lead us into talking about trusting relationships.
Thanks very much, Ivy. Okay, so trusting relationships, kind of hard to quantify, but we're going to try to talk through some common elements of a relationship that's built on a trusting foundation. So on the next slide, you'll see a definition, and there are lots of them. We like this one. And let me also say that every definition that I saw started with the phrase, a firm belief in, or a firm belief or confidence in, and then used a variety of different qualities: reliability, ability, character, strength, honesty, integrity, and so on. And it also always talked about either being someone or something in which confidence is placed. So some definitions also talked about faith, which I thought was really interesting. You can see on the screen, it's one of the synonyms for the term in this definition. And that really struck me because, trust is founded in belief, but the idea of faith seemed kind of bizarre, only in that I personally always think of trust as something that has to be earned, right? So maybe this idea of faith is something that we hold on to as long as trust is maintained. And so the person or institution that we've placed our trust in continues to earn that trust. And we have faith in them because we believe that they will continue to do so. So the quote on the next slide is one that I love. I think it really gets to the heart of that need to earn trust. And so you see, trust is earned when actions meet words. Another quote we came across while looking for wisdom on trust was from Abraham Lincoln. It's particularly apropos for today's topic. And he said that the people, when rightly and fully trusted, return the trust. And I think that's very fitting for our conversation here today. And so the next slide, you'll see, trust is a mutual process. As we become trusted by others, hopefully we're learning to trust them in return. But knowing that this takes so much time, why should we do it, right? Why bother to take the time to build trust? And in the simplest terms and most convenient definitions, building trust really facilitates our work. It gets things done. The bonds that trust creates help ensure that we're going to turn to each other when we need help. So we're more likely to be open to help when it's offered, to seek help when it's needed. Trust helps create those bridges between different groups in our communities. It allows us to open up more opportunities to work with each other, not be hindered by conflict that might be driven by misunderstanding. And it also links us together within our community as a network. And it means that, as we communicate more effectively, we'll have more access to resources of all kinds that can really help and support us in reaching our goals. And so what this is all well and good, but how do we do it? And so on the next slide, what you'll see is a word cloud, or a word block in this case, not really a cloud, that shows some of the words we came across as we researched trust building strategies. So first and foremost, we want to just call out the need to immerse ourselves in communities. The CDC has principles of community engagement that it shares, and they talk about establishing relationships, building trust, working with formal and informal leadership in communities, and seeking commitment from community organizations and leaders to co-create solutions. So that's their definition really of community engagement. And so using our orientation to cultural humility, right? We're going to need to recognize that people in our communities self-organize, and how they do that in our communities. What are those organizations that we need to reach and engage? Are they, sports leagues? Are they faith communities? Are they older adults who gather daily at the local cafe? Are there youth groups that we should be engaging? So on and so forth. We also need to recognize that members of these groups will have different experiences, both from within the group, from each other, and then maybe from ourselves. They may have many shared and unique assets and strengths that they can bring to our work. And they also may feel a certain way toward us as prevention professionals, given the nature of any previous attempts at engagement that they've experienced. Maybe they were successful in positive experiences. Maybe they were not positive experiences that resulted in tensions or conflict, right? So we have to be aware of all of this context, and then be authentic ourselves about what we don't know, and acknowledge that vulnerability, right? We need their perspectives because we don't know everything about our communities. We never will. And we know that they have valuable information and perspective and skills to contribute. And so here, we take the time, and here again is a reminder to give and take the gift of time to be curious, to hear the community's stories, and intentionally gather input from all community groups that we're trying to engage, including newcomers to our community, right? Sharing information that might help them feel more welcome, or maybe feel a sense of belongingness in the community, and sharing that information in the formats and in the languages that they prefer, since we know that communication really builds trust. I just want to pause because I know there's been responses in the chat. And so Deborah, every month, another individual is asked to lead the meetings, a great example. And then Ben, remind the coordinator that they have to tell the coalition that they have to be the ones to do the work and also guide the meetings, not run them. Just a couple quick examples, because a lot of challenges for coordinators in getting the coalition to do the work and not have the coalition rely on the coordinator to do everything. These are great observations. I may have shared this anecdote last week, so forgive me if my memory fails me, but some of the coalitions I've worked with in the past will joke, what is the role of a coalition coordinator? What is your job? And I'm their TA provider supporting them in that work. And, eventually we laugh because we realize it's to coordinate, right? And it's to really help coordinate the efforts of others, which is just as difficult as doing it yourself, right? It takes as much time or more time to coordinate other people's involvement in the work than it would be to do everything yourself. But that the goal at the end of the coalition meeting is to not have your name or their name as coordinator next to every action item, right? It's really to help facilitate that engagement, that involvement, and find ways for coalition members to contribute that are meaningful to them and that do advance the work of the group as well. So that both win situation is what we're really looking for through all of this work, where we're all benefiting from that collaboration. Stephanie, I see that you're noting that the challenge is to figure out how to delegate. It's super hard. Like I can tell you from firsthand experience, having done it myself and supporting groups to do it, it takes a lot of time, a lot of uncomfortable silences when you're asking, so who could help send these emails for us? Who would do these, key community member interviews for us? A lot of awkward silences and a lot of having to maybe suggest people take certain roles on given all of their skills and ability, right? Not saying it's easy, but definitely a worthy goal to pursue. Okay, so on the next slide, and thank you so much for these examples and for your engagement, we're going to revisit our coalition. We want to hear from you again. So, and we want to really draw from your experience about how you have taken steps to develop trust in your communities. And so we're going back to our coalition example to see what's new with them. And they are hearing anecdotally that there are many members of a new population group living in their community. And this would be families recently immigrated from Southeast Asia. And so the coalition wants to bring those voices to the table, would like to engage members from that group in prevention, planning, and implementation efforts, but understands that it has to start from a place of trust before doing this. And so from your experience, how would you suggest that the coalition members, the leadership, go about building trusting relationships with members from this group? So we're using the coalition example as a vehicle, but really want to hear from you how you would approach this if you needed to build some trusting relationships with newcomers or new members of a new population group to your community. Meals, Ben, thank you for starting us off. It's simple, it's straightforward, but everybody likes, well, I won't say everybody likes food. I'll say everybody needs to eat, right? So yeah, sharing meals is one of the best ways, I think, to get to know individuals, families, members of the community that you're trying to engage, right? So having the time to really connect and talk, it's hard to do if you're just briefly meeting, or, certainly hard to do over email. But the meal gives you that time to really learn their perspective, share yours, and begin developing that foundation of trust that you can build from. So that's a great example. Thank you. So Kelsey, find out if there are individuals within that community already involved in prevention work and invite them to the table. Absolutely. So we're looking for, possible champions within the group who are already bought into and participating in prevention, who, see the value of the work, and maybe great gatekeepers or cultural brokers to help us engage with other members of that group. Great idea. So gatherings with a purpose for the betterment of growth and outcomes, so that people attending will see the importance in attending, right? I think that that's a great idea as well. Yeah, so setting up these opportunities, right? If we come away with anything from today, it will likely be that, trust takes time, relationship building, we know, takes time, and it's an investment, right? And so your suggestions are great because it's all really around spending time getting to know each other. I think we've shared in the past, one of our colleagues sets up a coffice at Dunkin' Donuts. Coffee office is what coffice is a amalgamation of. And so she'll sit there for hours on end and just sip her coffee and meet with people from the community. She'll set up several conversations, and they'll just come together and have a cup of coffee and talk about, the news of the day and whatever else she wants to connect with them on, or they want to connect with her on. But, she's found that to be very successful, and just having that informal setting, not my office, not your office, just a place to come together and share and learn and develop those relationships over time. So anyway, great ideas coming in on this. I appreciate you drawing from your own experience and sharing how you'd approach this as a question. So that's just a quick primer on building trust. I know many of us come into this work with a lot of experience in doing that. Certainly build your experience on the ground in doing that. But from here, we're going to look at that third element of authentic engagement, following the community's lead to make change. So community-led solution finding. And I think, Ivy, you're going to walk us through that section. So I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Jess. So with this last section of really following the community's lead to make change, this is really, I think, such an interesting approach and shift in some of our thinking. As we go to the next slide, there is the quote that you'll see on screen that I just love to death. You may have heard of this one before. It's from the 6th century BCE, Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. Um, and I love it because it is such a strong and clear focus on leadership that's based on much of what we've covered in this series. It's shared leadership that's not lorded over or tightly held. It's leadership that engages the group to focus on achieving and targeting the win-win for all. It's on balancing and allocating resources to meet the common good. It's on taking and sharing perspective and then collaboratively working together to problem solve. So we have hit all 6 principles here. But what I love this is that community-led is not only the outcome, it's also the process. And so as we go to our next slide, I think the key thing that we want to highlight here is just a little bit more of why it's so important to have communities lead in these efforts. And in particular, we just want to highlight just a couple of key points. I think sometimes we forget that communities have the right to self-determination. And just as was noted very early in today's session, nothing about or for or concerning us without us being part of the conversation. And we know that, you know, the disabilities right community really has helped to clarify for so many of us the importance of being part of self-determination. But also we recognize that with these different points that are listed here, we're talking about balancing and sharing power. We're talking about not only releasing control and being flexible, and as someone noted, delegating as necessary, but also recruiting and empowering others to be part of, to be equal partners. It's the idea of not just having the community lead because they are present in the situation, but the American Medical, I think it's the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Centers, recently came out with an equity document that speaks to principles of trustworthiness. And one of their very first points is the fact that the community understands what the problem is. So our role in working with communities is allowing them and engaging them, asking them, inviting them, and even delegating to them the responsibilities of helping to identify what are the problems, what are the needs. And that's where so much of the sharing leadership, the decision-making responsibilities, and that power sharing really leads to stronger partnerships. Ultimately, it also leads to sustainability. Now, you know, I think in many of our cases, we might think about community-led initiatives that might have some questions for us, or that might raise some questions for us in terms of where does assessing community readiness fall in with this? And actually, community readiness is really the determination of the readiness of the community to take action. And it's based on what they view as what's reasonable, what's a logical path to the desired outcomes, and what's even achievable. But as we know, it is where and how the community not only sees that there is a feasible, that are reasonable, that there's a logical, and that there's an achievable pathway to solving and addressing the challenges noted, but that they have a role in helping to walk that path. And so as we go to our next slide, we'll just talk a little bit more about how might we do this? This is where I think it's so important, and I was having a conversation even earlier this morning where talking about the process being such an important component of this work, recognizing that we're going to be shifting more from a task-oriented model. And so while it's important to know who's present on your, not only in your community and your coalitions and what their styles may be, but recognizing that process is such an important part of this. It's not just assigning or identifying what the tasks are that need to be done, but how are we going to structure our practices, our communication styles, even our decision-making methods to support shared and community-led efforts. It's also, again, really understanding more about who the community is, really engaging them in participating, helping to facilitate and not just participate, but then also really being attentive to how relationships might be strengthened and those opportunities to contribute and recognize the contributions of all of those who are present and part of the process. So it might be recognizing and communicating that very, very consistently across the efforts that have been led by any of your community members and the role of the community in the process. So we're going to go to our next slide at this point, and we're going to pose for the same coalition in the community that Jess just noted. What we see is that a few years later, after the last scenario, we see that student survey data is really revealing that youth from Southeast Asian families reporting higher rates of anxiety and stress than their peers. And we see that parents of these students have voiced their concerns to teachers and other school staff. So how might the coalition support members of this community in addressing the issue? What are some strategies that you might encourage the coalition to take that will help the community members to really lead a response and lead engaging with the school and school staff? Are there any concepts that you might have been thinking about from our conversation in terms of shared leadership, in terms of perspective taking, in terms of thinking about shared power? Any suggestions, any thoughts? How can the coalition support members of the community in addressing this issue? Oh, I love that one. Holding a town hall meeting with key leaders and everyone else. And in that town hall, it would be a great opportunity for the community members to actually do some of the presentation. And the coalition can support parents and members of the community with actually sharing some of the data, even organizing and helping to plan that town hall. And Kelsey, great example and reminder. Yes, this is going back to that process, reminding us that we need to ask, how might community members, how might parents want to be supported? And don't just assume that we know how. Exactly. And in those conversations, it might even be saying, is there something that we can do to support you? Here are some things that we have done, or here are some ways that we have found helpful. Not always when you offer to someone, here's support that I might be able to provide, will they immediately know how they might want to use the support that's being offered, but that's a great opportunity to engage in conversation. And then I see there's also the opportunity for supporting conversations with youth who identify as members of the community to learn more about the issue from their perspective. So again, another opportunity, even maybe with focus groups and members of the community, even facilitating those focus groups, organizing or participating in those focus groups. With some of the communities that we've been working with lately, it's helping the coordinators to see that maybe the analysis doesn't have to just be done by you and have your name next to it, but that can be an opportunity for members not only of the coalition, but also of the broader community to be part of interpreting that data. Oh, great example, Julie. Having some of that literature to take home, as well as helpline phone numbers. So really maybe the coalition, if they've already have that information compiled, offering that to be shared, and maybe even helping to speak with parents of how to talk about that information, how to use that literature, how to share that literature with their peers, with other parents in different settings. These are great examples. Um, what we'd like to do is open up the floor a little bit more and invite you to share some of the additional comments, strategies that maybe you've used, but also we'd love to hear from you some of your questions and feedback. So we're going to go to our next slide, and we're going to just open the floor at this point. I see there's some other comments that are coming in. One is setting up listening sessions for students and parents within the schools district. And in particular, that's a great opportunity for maybe the community to help organize those, just as they might organize a town hall. Great. And community members might even have a great sense of where and what organizations or settings might be really helpful to engage broad swath of the community in those conversations. So I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have based on some of the approaches that either your colleagues have noted today that maybe you've prioritized for your next coalition meeting or your next method of outreach. Any additional comments? Any additional questions? Ooh. I see a great question in the chat, Jess, from Kelsey. I know our coalition needs to bring in new members to the table, and there are dwindling numbers right now and loss of enthusiasm. What are some strategies for recruiting new members? And others chiming in to note similar issues. Yes.
That is a great question. I'll just start talking off the top of my head, Ivy, and then when you start, you'll have a much better formed thought, I'm sure, than I do. But I definitely hear Julie and Kelsey this as an issue. You know, I have to assume a lot of this relates back to our shared collective experience over the past 2 years living through the pandemic, right? And the fatigue of all kinds that come through that. So I feel hesitant to share kind of what we would typically share as far as recruitment strategies, just because I think we have to acknowledge that this is not prevention business as usual. And I think that what you're experiencing may be not time limited, but might be just very much related to where we are collectively as a society. And it's something I know has heard, I know I've heard from a variety of different communities that I've been able to work with. So I see, Ben, you've put a suggestion in the chat, I think. So find the busiest thing in town, ask the organizers of that event to borrow a little of their time. Maybe it's a high school sport event, find out what their interests are and get them to your meetings to help promote the things that you're promoting. I think that that's a great idea. I think, absolutely looking to create engagement, recruitment events that are compelling, that are on topics that would be of interest, that would sort of fight through all of the other competing priorities and noise that people are sort of reacting to in the course of their daily lives, that would bring them into the room, is certainly a great idea as well, to make sure that our outreach efforts there's something really compelling about them that would draw people in. But I honestly think that if it's new members we're looking for, it is that relationship building piece. I will, when Ivy's talking, I'll stall for time and find a link to this YouTube video that I really like about one-on-one relational meetings. I think you're all, certainly doing this in the course of your work and likely expert at it, but it's just a nice reminder of sort of how we begin that conversation with prospective members, do that early relationship building, And it might just be a really time intensive process of one-on-one outreach, kind of targeted outreach to individuals who, bring certain perspectives or skill sets to the work, and starting from scratch to try to build some engagement that way. I don't have better suggestions in the moment. If we could reflect on it, Ivy, and follow up with ideas if it's helpful, I think. But let me turn it over to you, Ivy, to see what came up for you while I was talking.
So I'm going to say two things here. One is just in terms of the question, it's such a great question. Maybe, Jess, what we can do is consider having another conversation at some point. Um, Maybe even an open office hour where we just talk through on open lines, and invite people to share some strategies, and some efforts that they've tried. We'll invite folks to do that right now as well. But that's one thing that if you're interested and that would be of interest, let us know on your GIPRA survey as well as in the chat. The second thing that I'll note, I think, Jess, you've hit on, I think so much of what we're encountering is there is the overwhelmingness of COVID, and just the fact that so many of us are dealing with Zoom fatigue and virtual interaction fatigue. And in most cases, that's not how we develop relationships with people in that kind of a virtual environment. And so I would say that it really does go back to thinking about, just as you know, to building relationships, thinking about trying to use some of those in-person opportunities, thinking about really just getting to know people. One of the coordinators that I was speaking with recently noted that they go to lots and lots of meetings that are happening in the community, and they take notes throughout those meetings. And those notes serve for them as a way of remembering who was there, what were their issues and their values that they were highlighting, what were the concerns that they were highlighting. So then he can follow up and identify, sounds like there's some shared common goals that we have. I'd love to hear more about your work. And eventually you may get around to inviting that particular person to be part of the coalition, or maybe they can connect you with others who might be even more passionate about or more directly involved and engaged in the work. So those are just a couple of quick ideas, but
I think those are great, Ivy. And I just say I work. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just noting that you've posted the video in the chat, excuse me, the YouTube video in the chat. So I'll have to take a look at that one.
I sure did. And I go back to it often. I think it's a really nice example of how to do that kind of relationship building. And I just want to just normalize the experience further, because as you were speaking, Ivy, I was realizing, I'm working with a community that's leading a project in 3 other communities, including their own. So a four community project. And 2 of those communities signed on to be a part of the grant last year. And now that the grant has come through, they absolutely don't have the bandwidth to do it. And so I only share that to say, we're working together to think about, how do you get the work done when there is this real lack of ability in or enthusiasm or engagement for lots of good reasons. I think it's, like you said, Ivy, a really worthwhile topic to engage further in. So we've given a lot of strategies today about what authentic engagement looks like, how to try to bring partners to the table. And I think these are strategies that would be effective in a variety of settings and contexts. And, it's a whole new world as far as people feeling exhausted and overwhelmed and burnt out. So not to say that these aren't effective, but we have to just try them and make sure and test them in this particular context. And if not, come back together and see what solutions have been more effective, just given that kind of pervasive collective exhaustion that people are feeling. So I think, Ivy, I'll just mute myself because I think you're going to bring us to our wrap up now.
Yes. So thanks everyone for your comments and your ideas throughout today's session. As we noted, we really appreciate not only your feedback, but we live by your input for this and all of our sessions throughout the year. So we're going to ask that you complete the evaluation, the GIPRA survey. Um, Clara has posted the link in the chat as well. We hope that you'll complete that before you go too far away from today's session. We'd love to hear back from you. And if you are particularly interested in, furthering the conversation of dealing with maybe the burnout, the way of maybe authentically engaging and particularly engaging people in a challenging situation, let us know. The GIPRA survey will be one great way for you to have an opportunity to share that feedback with us. And then, of course, on our next slide, we do have our contact information. And so we invite you to be in touch with us if there's anything else that you would love to not only raise as a question, but also if there's anything that you would offer as a suggestion for a topic, future webinar, or technical assistance. We are available to provide technical assistance to you and your organizations. And so we ask that you don't hesitate to be in touch with us. And so we will be in the next week or so sharing with you the recording and the slides from today's session. We look forward to hearing back from you and to seeing your comments on the GIPRA survey. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks so much for your input and your crowdsourcing and sharing of strategies and approaches for authentic engagement. We look forward to hearing more. Take care, everybody.